The storm had been coming since dawn, rolling down from the high peaks like a gray curtain pulled across the sky. By mid-afternoon, snow drove sideways, a white fury that swallowed the forest, muffling the world into silence. Yet amid that silence, a man worked with relentless steadiness. Bare skin gleamed against the cold, broad chest, scarred shoulders, the frame of a warrior who had known both hunger and battle. His name was Tayan. Shirtless though the air cut like knives, he swung his axe into the pine log, each strike echoing sharp and final. Steam rose from his skin, mixing with the ghostly swirl of snowflakes that clung to his long black hair. He neither shivered nor paused. The cabin he had built with his own hands stood solitary among the fir trees. Smoke wound upward from the chimney, a pale thread against the storm's darkness. Solitude was not new to him. It had been his companion for years, a stern comfort after war and betrayal had stripped him of kin. His heart beat steady as the axe, and like the axe, it cut through each day, severing hours from one another until night fell and dawn returned. But this day would not remain clean and severed. This day, strangers approached. Two figures trudged along the buried trail, bent against the wind. Their cloaks were crusted white, boots sinking deep into the drifts. One walked with a kind of fierce determination, steady even when the wind shoved against her shoulders. The other stumbled often, frilier, her steps wavering as though each one might be her last. They had no business being in this wilderness, not at such an hour, not with the snow swallowing all paths. Yet desperation drives where wisdom falters, and their desperation showed in every trembling movement. The first was Martha Thompson, Mattie to those who knew her well. 20 years old, but her eyes bore a weariness beyond that number, a fire too, banked but alive. She had dark hair tucked beneath her bonnet, strands whipping free like lashes of ink against her pale cheek. She gritted her teeth and held the other woman's arm, half dragging, half supporting her forward. Jean Whitfield, the frilier one, had auburn hair damp with melting snow, face pale as parchment, lips blued by the cold. She looked like she could crumble if the wind pressed harder. They had walked out of town that morning with nowhere else to go. Behind them lay wagging tongues, sneers muttered just loud enough to sting. Jean had been called useless, a fragile flower that no man could want, not when whispers claimed she was too frail for bearing sons. Mattie bore harsher names, ruined, shameless, a girl with no guardian worth respecting. They had been turned from doors, pitted in glances but never welcomed. And so, half blind in snow, they went where no decent folk would follow, to the cabin of the Apache giant. Tayan noticed them only when the axe struck through the last splinter of pine, and silence followed. He straightened, chest rising with controlled breath, and fixed his dark gaze toward the trees. He had known they were coming before they ever stepped into sight. The forest had a way of speaking to him, broken branches, the hush of snow displaced by feet and used to wilderness paths. And then he saw them emerge from the white swirl. The taller woman stopped, eyes wide. For an instant she faltered, seeing him bare-chested among snow and storm, like some spirit carved out of the mountain. But she steadied herself, gripping Jean tighter. "Sir," she called, though the wind stole half the word. "We need shelter." Tayan said nothing. His axe rested against the block. He looked at them as though they were ghosts, intrusions from a world he had buried. His silence stretched long, broken only by Jean's cough as she doubled over, too weak to hold herself upright. Mattie's voice sharpened. "Please! She'll die out here." Still, he did not move. His jaw worked once, eyes narrowing. He had seen settlers before, seen them drive his people from land, seen them spit on his name. Women or not, he had no reason to trust. Alone he had remained, and alone he would endure. Then Jean collapsed fully into the snow. Her knees buckled, her body folding like a cloth dropped to the floor. Mattie cried out, clutching her, trying to lift but failing. The snow began to bury Jean's skirts as the storm thickened. For a heartbeat longer, Tayan stood unmoved, the ghost of old betrayals whispering in his ear. But then he stepped forward. His stride was silent, deliberate, each movement carved with purpose. He knelt beside Jean, his shadow falling over her small trembling form. Mattie's eyes widened. Fear, relief, suspicion tangled together. Without asking, without speaking, Taein slid his arms beneath Jean, and lifted her, as though she weighed no more than a child. Against his bare chest, her chilled body shivered once and went still. The women had entered his cabin before, but only in rumors that swirled through town, that if you sought the Apache giant, he would cast you into snow. Now, in truth, Jean's pale hand hung limp over his arm as he bore her across the threshold. The warmth of fire met them inside, logs snapping in the stone hearth. Maddie followed, hesitant, gaze darting across the rough-hewn walls, the simple wooden bed, the table scarred by years of use. The place smelled of pine smoke and leather. She shut the door hard against the storm and leaned back, breathing fast. Taein laid Jean gently upon the bed, covering her with a heavy buffalo robe. Her eyes fluttered open, half-focused, and she looked up at him. Something passed across her expression. Fear, awe, maybe shame. Her lips moved but no sound came. "You'll not send us back out?" Maddie asked. Her tone edged with challenge though her body trembled. Taein's silence lingered. Then he shook his head once, slow, final. Not permission, not welcome, only acknowledgement. Hours stretched. The storm raged, rattling the shutters, howling down the chimney. Maddie kept close to her friend, coaxing Jean to sip warm broth Taein set before them without words. The man sat by the fire, tending it with a patience that belonged to someone who had long ago surrendered to solitude. He did not look at them often, yet every gesture was precise, measured, as though even kindness cost him something. Jean studied him from beneath the robe, her eyes tracing the lines of scars across his arms, the breadth of his shoulders. Shame pressed against her ribs, shame for needing his mercy, for being cast out, for trembling like a child while he bore the storm half bare. But beneath the shame, a strange comfort kindled. He had not abandoned her. When she finally whispered, "Thank you," her voice so soft it was nearly swallowed by the storm, Taein's head turned slightly. His gaze found hers. No words passed, yet something unspoken bound the moment. Maddie noticed, and suspicion sharpened her features. She placed herself between them, adjusting the robe around Jean, eyes hard upon the man. She trusted no one, least of all a stranger of his kind. Night deepened. Firelight painted the cabin in flickering gold. Shadows moved along the log walls, whispering of stories none dared to tell. Jean drifted into uneasy sleep, her breath thin but steady. Maddie sat watchful, jaw clenched. Taein remained near the fire, eyes fixed on flame but mind elsewhere, far away in memories too heavy to name. Outside, the snow swallowed the world whole. Inside, 3 exiles shared one fragile circle of warmth. Each carried shame like a hidden wound. Each carried rejection fresh as the storm. And in that silence, something had shifted. The first crack in years of solitude, the first thread between strangers. Yet shadows of judgment lingered in the distance, waiting to reach this cabin. For though the storm had hidden them tonight, the world would not forget them come morning. The storm did not relent. For 3 days snow pressed down upon the cabin like a heavy hand, burying the pines to their shoulders, sealing paths, silencing the world. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and venison stew, the fire's crackle the only steady sound. The walls creaked under the storm's weight, yet within them 3 souls lived in uneasy rhythm. Jean spent most hours near the bed, wrapped in buffalo hide, strength returning little by little. The color had begun to seep back into her cheeks, though she still shivered at times, as though some part of her could not quite believe she had been saved. Maddie hovered close, fussing with the robe, adjusting bowls, watching with the eyes of someone who feared safety might vanish at any moment. And Taein moved about the cabin in silence, a shadow among shadows, tending fire, sharpening blades, stepping out into the storm for firewood, and returning with snow clinging to his shoulders. He spoke little, not because he lacked words but because words had long since proven fragile, easily broken, twisted, discarded. His silence was not emptiness, it was armor. Yet in that silence, gestures formed bridges. On the second morning, when Jean rose too quickly and swayed, Taein's hand reached out, steadying her elbow before she could fall. He did not look at her face, only guided her back to the bed and returned to the fire. Still, she felt the imprint of his palm long after. That evening, he set a wooden figure beside her broth, carved from pine, the shape of a bird mid-flight. Jean touched it with trembling fingers, her throat too tight for words. Maddie noticed, eyes narrowing. She mistrusted his silence, mistrusted the weight of his gaze when it lingered. Yet even she could not deny the small mercies he offered. When her boots, cracked at the seams, gave way, she found them patched the next morning, leather stitched with care. She said nothing, only slipped them on, testing the seams, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of thanks. Beyond the cabin walls, the storm carried news back to town. Gossip traveled faster than any rider, whispered from lips to ears at the general store, the saloon, the church steps. Widow Hattie Jones spoke loudest, shaking her head with sorrowful relish. 2 young women, alone with him? The savage lives wild in the woods, half naked even in snow. Lord knows what happens in that cabin. Others joined, eager for scandal. The sheriff frowned, muttering about decency, about women led astray. The tale grew larger with each telling, until the cabin was no longer a refuge but a spectacle of sin in the minds of the townsfolk. None of this reached Jean or Maddie yet, but they felt its shadow. Maddie, especially, carried suspicions sharp as a blade, always glancing at the door as though expecting someone to burst in with judgment. Jean's shame was gentler, quieter, a weight behind her eyes. She had lived her life being deemed fragile, unwanted, now hidden away in a stranger's home like a secret. Yet beneath her shame stirred something else, an unfamiliar warmth, fragile as the bird carved in pine. On the 3rd night, when the storm finally broke into silence, the moon spread pale light over drifts stacked high against the cabin. Stars glimmered hard and cold. Jean woke restless and stepped carefully from the bed. She crossed the room, shawl clutched tight, and stood at the frost-covered window. Outside, the forest gleamed silver, untouched, holy. She turned slightly, and in the fire's dim glow she saw Tayan by the hearth, eyes half closed, knife still in his hand from carving. He looked weary, shadows drawn beneath his eyes, but there was a softness there too, a kind of watchfulness not meant to be seen. Jean's breath caught. "You, keep us safe," she whispered, not sure if the words were meant for him or only for herself. His eyes opened, dark and steady upon her. For a long moment no sound stirred, only the whisper of wind outside. Then he inclined his head once, slow, acknowledging but not claiming. It was enough. Jean returned to the bed, heart thudding strangely, warmth spreading beneath her ribs where cold had long dwelled. The next morning, Maddie confronted him. She stood firm near the table, arms crossed. "When the storm clears we'll leave," she said flatly. "We won't be your burden." Tayan paused, setting down the knife. His gaze moved from her to Jean, still asleep, to the fire. He did not reply. Silence, again, his language. "Do you hear me?" Maddie pressed, anger covering fear. At last he spoke, his voice low, rough from disuse. "Snow is deep. Roads closed." "Not yet." Maddie blinked. The sound of his words startled her, though they were simple. She wanted to argue, but Jean stirred, coughing softly, and her resolve faltered. She turned away, muttering, "We'll see." That afternoon, Jean tried to help with the stew. She stood at the table, weak hands clumsy with the knife. Tayan watched a moment, then stepped beside her, covering her hand with his, guiding the blade steady through carrots. She startled at his nearness, at the heat of his palm, but did not pull away. Their breaths mingled in the cold draft of the cabin, and for a fleeting second the silence between them was not armor but shelter. When Maddie saw, she slammed a pot lid down too hard, the clang sharp in the room. Neither spoke of it. By evening, the sound of hooves carried faintly through the snow-laden trees. All three froze. Tayan's eyes narrowed, muscles taut. Maddie moved to the window, peering out, heart hammering. In the distance, lanterns bobbed like fireflies among the drifts. "Riders." "They're coming," Maddie whispered, dread thick in her throat. Jean sat up, clutching the robe around her shoulders. Her eyes sought Tayan's face, searching for any sign of what it meant. He stood motionless, gaze fixed beyond the walls, as though he could see through storm and night. The riders' lanterns glowed closer, the sound of horses muffled by snow but relentless. In the silence that followed, Jean's heart knew before her mind did. The world had found them. The riders did not reach the cabin that night. Lanterns flickered at the edge of the forest, then faded, swallowed by distance. Yet their brief presence hung in the room like a breath held too long. Maddie sat rigid until the light vanished. Jean pressed her hands together beneath the buffalo robe, whispering a prayer too faint to catch. Tayan only stared into the fire, jaw locked, as if the flames might devour more than wood. When silence returned, it was not the silence of safety, but the kind that waits, heavy with what will come. That weight pressed on them through the long hours until dawn. The snow had softened by morning, light streaming pale and clean through the frost-blurred window. Jean stirred from troubled dreams and found herself staring at the wooden bird Tayan had carved, perched on the table as if it might lift away into sky. She reached for it with delicate fingers. "Why do you keep it?" Maddie asked from the corner, her tone clipped. Jean hesitated. "Because it reminds me I'm not gone yet." Maddie sighed, weary of her friend's softness. She wrapped her shawl tighter and muttered, "We shouldn't rely on him." Her words struck true in the still air. For though he had saved them, though his silence wrapped around them like rough cloth, neither woman knew what kind of man lived in these woods, alone, scarred, carrying stories unsaid. That evening, with the storm finally quieted, Jean rose from the bed and approached the fire where Tayan sat sharpening his blade. Her voice trembled. "You don't have to keep us here. We don't want to trouble you." He lifted his gaze. His eyes, dark as the earth under snow, held no anger, only depth. "You would not survive the road," he said slowly, words weighted by care. His English was halting, but his tone was firm. Jean lowered her eyes. She wanted to protest, to insist she was not as fragile as all had claimed, yet her body betrayed her with weakness. "Perhaps you're right," she whispered. "I've always been less." At that word, his gaze sharpened. "Less?" "They all said it," Jean confessed, voice cracking like thin ice. "My suitor, the women in town. I wasn't strong enough. Couldn't bear children, they said. Couldn't even carry a pail without stumbling. He left me before vows were spoken. They all saw me as useless." Her hand trembled where it clutched the robe. "And I started to believe them." Silence followed, deep as the snow outside. Maddie's eyes softened, anger slipping into grief for her friend. And Tayan, for the first time, set aside his blade. His chest rose, fell, rose again, as if he wrestled with ghosts before speaking. "My people!" He paused, words hard to shape. "They were called less. Called nothing. Driven from land. Children buried in snow. Women beaten down by soldiers. Men hunted like wolves. And yet, we breathed." He looked into the fire, not at her. To breathe is not less. The room seemed to still around his words. Jean's lips parted, but no reply came. Instead, tears burned at her eyes. Hot, humiliating, but cleansing too. Later, when Maddie and Jean busied themselves with mending clothes, Maddie's hands shook as she tried to thread a needle. Tayan's gaze flickered over her, but he said nothing, until finally she slammed the cloth down. "What do you see when you look at us?" she demanded. "Two pitiful girls needing saving? Two burdens you'll be rid of when the snow clears." Her voice cracked at the end. Beneath her anger was fear, raw and bleeding. Tayan studied her with that same steady silence. When he spoke, it was not the answer she expected. "I see fight. Like a tree bent in wind, not broken." Maddie blinked. For the first time since they had entered, her sharpness faltered. She turned away, pressing her lips tight, unwilling to let gratitude show. That night, shadows deepened around the cabin. The three of them sat close to the fire, each wrapped in thought. Jean dared a question into the quiet. "Your scars, how did you come by them?" The flames reflected in Tayan's eyes. He lifted his arm, tracing one jagged line across his shoulder. "Raid. Soldiers came when I was a boy. Took my mother, my sister. I fought. I was cut, beaten, left. But I lived." His voice lowered. "Too many did not." Jean's throat ached. She wanted to reach across the space, to touch his scar, to share the burden. But her hand remained in her lap, trembling. Maddie swallowed hard. Her gaze softened in spite of herself. "I lost my father," she said, almost unwilling. "They said I should marry quick, before hunger drove me desperate. Men came with their eyes greedy, not kind. One cornered me, and when I pushed him off, he called me ruined. The town believed him. They always believe the men." Her jaw set, but her voice shook. "I've been running from shame ever since." The fire popped, scattering sparks like brief stars. In that silence, all three wounds lay open, each bleeding quietly. Without a word, Tayan reached to the small pot of herbs on the shelf. He crushed them in his palm, pressed them into a cloth, and set it gently into Maddie's hands. "For shaking," he said simply. She stared at the cloth, unable to speak. Slowly, she nodded. For Jean, he carved another figure, a fawn this time, delicate and small. He set it beside her while she dozed, not knowing she would wake to find it in the morning, and press it to her chest like a secret. The days bled into one another, snow softening, light returning. Inside the cabin, their breaths wove together. Trust was not spoken, but it took root like seeds under frost, unseen yet alive. And still, beyond those walls, whispers spread. Hattie Jones' tongue wagged sharper than ever. "Those girls won't come back the same," she said in the store, voice dripping with false pity. "If they come back at all." Men muttered agreement, their faces eager for scandal. The sheriff frowned deeper each day. The gossip became a storm of its own, brewing stronger than the snow had been. And though Jean and Maddie did not yet hear its roar, they felt it in the way the forest grew restless, in the tension of Tayan's shoulders when he listened to the wind. On the sixth night, Jean awoke to find him seated at the table, head bowed over a scrap of leather. She rose quietly, her step soft, and came near. He looked up, caught by her presence. "You carry too much," she whispered. His hand stilled on the leather. "And you carry too little?" His gaze pierced hers. "No. Pain is pain. It weighs the same." Her breath caught, heart beating fast. In that moment she wanted to tell him what she had never dared, that she did not fear him, that in his silence she felt safer than in the voices of all the men who had scorned her. But the words lodged in her throat. Instead she reached for the leather scrap. Her fingers brushed his. Warmth sparked, quiet but undeniable. His eyes flickered, as though startled by something long forgotten. The door rattled suddenly, struck by wind, or perhaps by something more. All three turned toward it, hearts pounding. And then came the sound. Hooves again, closer this time. Voices carried faint through the snow. The riders had returned. The sound of hooves pressed through the snow like a drumbeat, muffled but relentless. Lanterns swung between dark trunks, their glow flickering against the white world. Maddie stiffened, hand clenching Jean's arm as if she could hold her steady by force alone. Jean's breath came shallow, chest rising and falling beneath the heavy robe. Tayan stood near the door, every muscle drawn tight, his body carved into stillness the way the pines braced against wind. Then came the knock. 3 strikes, sharp, authoritative. The cabin walls seemed to flinch. Maddie whispered, "Don't open it." But Tayan did. The door swung wide to reveal Sheriff Amos Carter with 2 townsmen at his side. Snow plastered to their coats, lantern light carving their faces into harsh angles. The sheriff's hat brim dripped with meltwater, but his eyes were dry and cold. "Evenin'," he said, voice flat. His gaze swept the room, landing on Jean and Maddie before settling back on Tayan. "Looks like the rumors were true." Maddie lifted her chin. "We came here ourselves." "That so?" Carter's lips twisted. "Town's concerned. Young women stayin' out here with—" His eyes slid over Tayan's bare chest, the scars visible even in firelight. "With someone like him. Ain't proper. Ain't safe." Jean flinched at the words, as if they were lashes. Tayan said nothing, though the weight in his silence thickened the air. "We'll take him back," Carter declared, stepping into the cabin uninvited. "Snow's passable now. They'll be better off in town, under decent care." Maddie's voice sharpened. "Better off? You turned us out. Every door shut in our faces." Now you come claimin' what's decent." The sheriff's jaw hardened. "I won't argue with a girl who don't know what's best for her. This is about order. Reputation. A man like him," he jabbed a finger toward Tayan, "ain't fit company for any woman." The words struck deep. Tayan's shoulders tightened, but he did not move. Jean's eyes filled with heat she could not contain. She rose shakily, legs trembling, but her voice, though soft, cut through. "He saved me. If not for him, I'd be buried under the snow. Does that sound unfit?" Her defiance startled even Maddie. Carter scoffed, shaking his head. "Gratitude don't change truth, girl. You'll come with us. Both of you." He motioned to the men at his back, who stepped forward with grim readiness. The cabin shrank around them. The fire hissed, logs collapsing inward. Maddie planted herself in front of Jean, fury trembling through her small frame. "You'll have to drag us." One townsman sneered. "Easy done." The moment stretched, heavy as storm clouds. Then Tayan moved. Not with violence, but with quiet certainty. He stepped between the women and the intruders, his height filling the space, shadow towering in the firelight. His voice came low, gravel-edged but steady. "They stay." Carter's eyes narrowed. "That a threat?" Tayan did not answer. His silence was sharper than any blade. The sheriff shifted, unease flickering in his posture, though his pride bound him from retreat. "Think hard. Folks already whisper plenty. You keep him here, it only worsens. For them, for you." Jean's throat tightened. She wanted to speak again, to shout her truth, but shame pressed heavy. Shame for the way she'd been named fragile. Shame for standing in a cabin where her presence was judged unclean. Yet behind that shame flickered the memory of Tayan's hand guiding hers on the knife, of the carved fawn she kept hidden under her pillow. The world called her less. But here in his silence, she felt seen. "I will not go," she whispered. Maddie's breath caught. The sheriff's brows rose, disbelief twisting into anger. "You'll regret defying the town." Jean swayed but did not step back. She reached, trembling, until her fingers brushed the rough fabric at Tayan's side. The gesture was small, nearly invisible, yet it rang louder than any digitation. For the first time his eyes shifted. Not to the sheriff, not to the townsman, but down to her hand against him. Something old and locked within him cracked, faint but undeniable. The men saw it too. The sneer deepened. "So it's true," one spat. "Savage and settler. Shameful." Maddie bristled, fury spilling from her like sparks from the hearth. "Better shame with him than ruin with the lot of you." The room erupted. Carter barked her name, the men surged forward, and in that instant Tayan moved with speed honed by survival. He blocked the doorway, body a wall of muscle and will. The men stumbled against him, their weight nothing before his strength. He did not strike first, only pushed, firm and immovable, sending them stumbling back into snow. The sheriff's hand twitched toward his revolver. "Careful," he warned. "You raise hand to law, you won't live to regret it." Tayan's eyes burned with quiet fire. He did not flinch. The crackle of the fire filled the silence, the women's breaths fast and shallow. At last Carter cursed low. He gestured sharply, and the men stepped back, snow crunching beneath boots. "This ain't done," he spat. "Town won't stomach it. You'll see." He turned, lantern swinging, and the three figures disappeared into the night, swallowed by snow and distance once more. The door shut. Silence returned, but not the same silence as before. This one pulsed with the echo of conflict, with the weight of choices that could not be undone. Maddie slumped against the table, fists shaking. Jean's knees gave, and she sank to the bed, pressing her hand to her chest. She looked at Tayan, standing motionless near the door. His breath came heavy, but his face remained carved of stone. "You didn't let them take us," Jean whispered, her voice fragile but sure. He did not reply. Yet something flickered in his gaze when it met hers, something unspoken, both burden and promise. The fire burned low. Snow pressed against the cabin walls. Far off, a wolf howled into the night, long and mournful. And within, three hearts beat louder than the storm. bound now not only by survival but by defiance. But defiance carries a price. The town would not forget. And when they returned, it would not be with words alone. The morning broke pale and heavy, the world outside hushed beneath layers of snow that gleamed like glass. Frost feathered the cabin window, light catching in its patterns like tiny rivers frozen mid-course. Inside, the fire smoldered low, its warmth faint against the weight that pressed on each of them. None spoke of the sheriff's visit, yet it lingered in the room, in Maddie's restless pacing, in Jean's quiet hands clutching the wooden fawn against her chest, in Tayan's stillness as he sharpened his knife with steady, deliberate strokes. The silence was broken not by words but by the sound of hooves again, nearer, heavier, more certain. Lanterns glowed through the trees, multiplied. More riders this time, more shadows cutting through the snow. Jean's lips parted in a soft gasp. Maddie gripped her arm, eyes burning with fear and fury both. Tayan set the knife down slowly, his breath steady though his jaw tightened until the scar along his cheek whitened. The door shook under another knock, harsher than before. Sheriff Carter's voice carried through the wood, sharp as ice. "Step aside, Apache. This ends today." No one moved. The fire snapped. Jean's heart hammered so hard it hurt. She rose on trembling legs, and though Maddie tried to pull her back, she shook free. "If we go," she whispered to Tayan, her voice so soft it was nearly lost, "everything we've found here ends." His gaze met hers. For once it was not silence but something deeper, recognition, as though he had been waiting all these years for a voice to speak the truth he had carried alone. He touched her hand, a brief brush of warmth, then turned to the door. When he opened it, the storm had quieted, but the men had gathered like wolves, a half-circle of lanterns and rifles gleaming in the dim light. Carter sat astride his horse, face pinched with resolve. Behind him, Widow Hattie hovered, bundled in furs, her voice loud with self-righteous fire. "Those girls must come back. We won't have them ruined here in sin." Maddie's anger spilled over. She stormed past Jean, voice trembling with rage. "You shut your doors on us, called us names, spat on us. And now you want to save us? From what? From the only man who showed mercy." The crowd stirred uneasily, some eyes flickering with doubt, others hardened with judgment. Carter raised a hand. "That's enough. You'll come down, both of you. We won't have this shame staining our town." Jean stepped forward then, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, auburn hair catching faint light. She stood beside Tayan though her body shook. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut sharper than any shout. "I choose to stay." The words hung in the frozen air. The townsfolk shifted, murmurs rising. Hattie's mouth opened and shut like a fish caught gasping. Carter's eyes darkened. "Then you've sealed his fate. You'll bring ruin on him too." One man raised his rifle, the barrel glinting. Maddie cried out, grabbing Jean's arm, but Tayan moved before fear could root them. He stepped forward, body a shield, broad shoulders framed by firelight spilling through the open door. His voice rang out, deep and steady, carrying into the night. "No more." The tension cracked like ice giving way. A shot rang out, shattering the stillness, splintering wood near the cabin door. Jean screamed. Maddie dragged her down, covering her head, while Tayan surged forward with a roar not of rage but of survival. He wrenched the rifle from the man's hands, the snow exploding beneath their struggle. The crowd scattered back, lanterns swinging wildly. Carter pulled his gun, but before he could fire, Maddie seized a burning log from the hearth and hurled it into the snow at his horse's feet. The animal reared, screaming, and Carter was thrown, crashing into the drift with a curse. Panic rippled through the riders. None had expected resistance, not from women, not from the silent giant they thought broken. Tayan stood tall in the snow, breath steaming, fists clenched around the stolen rifle. He did not raise it to kill, only to hold, to show he would not bow. The sight of him, scarred and unbending, against the swirl of snow and firelight, struck the crowd into silence. Jean rose from the doorway, hair loose, cheeks flushed with terror and defiance. She stepped into the snow, her skirts dragging heavy, and placed herself at his side. Her hand found his arm, small and trembling, but her chin lifted. "If you take him, you take me too." The words stunned even Maddie. The crowd gaped, murmurs turning uncertain. What had been scandal now wavered into something else, something raw and undeniable. A woman too frail to carry water, standing tall against her own town, declaring herself with the one they named unfit. Hattie sputtered, but her voice cracked. It's wicked, shameful. Yet no one echoed her. The men shifted, their anger faltering beneath the weight of Jean's quiet resolve and Tayan's silent strength. Carter staggered to his feet, snow clinging to his coat. His pride burned hotter than reason. You'll regret this, he spat. Both of you. This ain't over. But his words rang hollow. The crowd was breaking, some turning their horses, others lowering their rifles. Shame does not hold firm when faced with something truer. At last, Carter mounted again, rage in his eyes, but he gave no further order. With a sharp jerk of the reins, he led them back into the trees, lanterns dimming one by one until the forest swallowed them. Silence fell once more, heavy, fragile. Snow drifted down, soft as ash. Jean swayed, her breath catching, and Tayan caught her before she could fall. He lifted her easily, carrying her back into the cabin, where the fire still glowed faint. Maddie followed, shutting the door hard against the night. Inside, the three of them stood in the glow of firelight, the weight of what had passed pressing on their shoulders. No words came at first. Only the sound of their breathing, the crack of settling logs. Jean touched his chest where her hand had rested in the snow, her eyes meeting his. They will come again, she whispered. His gaze softened, a rare flicker of warmth breaking through. Let them. Maddie sank onto the bench, laughter trembling out of her like a sob. I never thought I'd see the day when gossip lost to truth. Jean leaned into Tayan, her frailty no longer weakness but a kind of strength that had drawn him from his silence. For the first time in years, he let his hand rest against another's, not as a shield, not as a gesture of duty, but as something chosen. The snow outside would not cease, nor would the whispers in town. Yet within the cabin, something greater had taken root. Dignity wrested from shame, love born not of digiancians but of small, fierce acts of grace. The fire flared, sparks shooting upward like fleeting stars. Jean's eyes glistened, her lips parting in a soft breath, and she whispered words she had never dared before. I am not less. And in the silence that followed, those words filled the cabin more fully than any flame.